Okay, let's jump right in. We are opening a case file today, but it feels less like a legal document and more like, well, a piece of avant-garde art. It's this really bizarre collision of sophisticated housing fraud, radical philosophy, and a creative rebellion that uses the legal system itself as its canvas.
And yeah, that quote from the source material, it pretty much nails the tone. What we're about to unpack is intentionally confusing. It's a story designed not just to be told, but to actively mess with our perception of what's real, what's a narrative, and what's true.
So, to make any sense of it, here's our game plan. We'll start with how fractured all the evidence is, then dig into the concrete fraud allegations, check out the wild artistic response it sparked, get our heads around the philosophy they used, and finally, look at the big systemic critique at the heart of the whole thing.
All right, so Section 1. This phrase, "we are all cut-ups," was apparently scrawled on a broken window in the source material, and it's the perfect way to describe this case. The story isn't a straight line. It's pieced together from all these different fragments, court documents, experimental write-in, police reports, dense philosophy, all just smashed together.
Which brings us to the central puzzle, right? How do these pieces even connect? I mean, what happens when the language of a lawsuit and the language of a poem are forced to occupy the exact same space, trying to tell the exact same story?
So here's the key takeaway. We're following two parallel stories at the exact same time. On one hand, you've got this detailed, almost technical account of a complex real estate scam. And on the other hand, you have the story of the people who were targeted by it, who decided to fight back, not just with lawyers, but with art.
Okay, so let's dive into that first track, the allegation. The source material calls this whole thing a house of cards. You know, a structure that looks solid but is built on a totally unstable foundation. In this case, it was an alleged systematic property fraud scheme in Los Angeles.
And the alleged scheme was incredibly methodical. The sources lay out a whole playbook. You've got shell companies to hide who really owns what. Then there's this idea of injecting corrupted syntax, things like fake addresses and hidden liens, right into the city's official records. They'd even file for permits using bogus parcel numbers to get around tenant protections and use sham bankruptcy filings just to stall for more time. And get this wasn't just some abstract paperwork crime. The legal filings accused the perpetrators of aggravated trespass while taking over these properties. This wasn't happening in some far-off office building. It was confrontational, it was in your face, and deeply invasive.
This quote from the documents really shows you where it was all headed. The entire operation was supposedly built on a mountain of debt, a financial house of cards. They weren't just borrowing money, they were borrowing time, and the clock was about to run out. But here, this is where the story just takes a completely wild turn. In response to this legal and financial attack, the targets didn't just call a lawyer. Nope. They turned their entire experience into a living, breathing art project. This is art as a weapon.
So let's start with a tiny, almost absurd detail, pulled straight from a description of events. In the middle of this whole conflict, the bathroom door in the house was removed. Just gone. A dry, factual, legal detail. And this just perfectly shows their method. That mundane, invasive fact is immediately recycled, reappearing almost word for word in a piece of creative writing. They turned a moment of violation into a line of prose. They were literally transcribing their lives into art in real time.
And this was happening everywhere. They wrote about their court appearances as if it were a fictional chapter. One of the artists recalled a past project, a tennis ball machine, and called it a goddamn sculpture, an object just performing for itself. They would spread their ideas on these fluorescent flyers. Their entire life became a performance, all guided by this one mantra: live my work. So you might be asking, how on earth do you even make sense of this? Well, to get their response, you have to get their worldview. And that brings us to the philosophical lens they use to process everything, this idea of living in a recursive world. At the heart of it is this concept they call recursive vector interference, or RVI. Okay, sounds complicated, but let's break it down. A vector is just a force with direction, like a legal argument or an artistic statement. Interference is when those forces smash into each other. And recursive just means it happens over and over again. So RVI is the act of intentionally crashing contradictory ideas together, the lawsuit and the poem, the fraud and the art, not to create chaos, but to actually hammer out a new, deeper understanding of what's happening. And this comparison chart really clarifies the difference. You know, where a conventional view sees reality as this fixed thing we just discover,
The recursive view sees it as a dynamic system that can be actively terraformed. Discovery isn't just finding something that's already there. It's hard work. It's meaning that you construct through disturbance.
And this is their kind of grand unified theory on the whole thing. A story isn't just a story. It's a cognitive tool, a compression algorithm for processing all that interference. It's how our brains take all those colliding ideas and spit out a single, coherent insight, whether that's a memory, an identity, or a piece of art.
Okay, so let's zoom that lens out now and look at the bigger target of their critique, the entire bureaucratic system, which they see as this kind of broken, endless loop.
When we talk about something like a housing crisis, this is the question we all instinctively ask, isn't it? It's the metric for success we expect our institutions to care about.
But according to the critique in these documents, that is completely the wrong question. It's not what this system is actually designed to answer.
The real question, the metric that actually keeps the whole machine running, is this one. How many were moved? Because think about it, as long as there's motion, people moving from shelters to temporary housing and then back to the streets, there is a crisis. And as long as there is a crisis, there is funding. The system, in a way, needs the problem it claims to solve.
And this quote, which the source attributes to the filmmaker Jean-Luc Godard, just cuts right to the bone. The chaos isn't a bug in the system, it's the feature. It's a machine that actually feeds on instability. It's entropy disguised as governance.
Which brings us to this final note from one of the core texts in our case file. It says, right there in black and white, that while the names are made up, the story is real and factual. It's the final deliberate blurring of that line, leaving us, the reader, stuck right in the middle of that recursive interference.
And so, we're left with this question. When reality is being actively terraformed and stories are used as cognitive weapons, what tools do we even have left to tell fact from fiction? When a legal battle becomes a chapter in a novel, what's the real difference between a case file and a story?